Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. So we have 2 microphones on the aisles, so please line up and we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond. And then we'll see how far we'll go with the questions. Why don't we start from there, please?
Hey, thanks a lot for the talk. So actually it was more than interesting. My question to Enrico is about the transmission potential. I think you were expecting that I'm going to ask, right? I'm just curious about the entomological parameters used to highlight the transmission potential for malaria in Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take one on either side, please. Okay.
All right. My name is Karine. I'm a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. My question is for Jesse. Regarding the drought, do you looked on what the cause? Is it a heat shock? The temperature was too high? Is it air quality, more aerosol in the atmosphere that caused those effects that you saw?
Okay. Thanks. Please.
Thank you for the presentation. My name's Steve Louie. I'm a professor of infectious diseases at Stanford. And my question's for Nagla. It looks like when you're building this index that you're actually comparing 2 quite different values, a value of the environment versus a value of human nutrition. Your index says, well, I'm just going to put these together. It seems to me there are some implicit assumptions about weighting, maybe weighting about equal weighting or not. And it gets to a core issue that we face in planetary health, and that is how much do we value ecosystems as intrinsically useful, and how much do we value human health? So I would be interested in your decisions about the values that go into thinking about how you actually construct the index.
Thanks. So.
Hi, Sam Myers from Harvard. So I had a question for Jesse that's very similar, but we know that if we look at patterns of temperature and precipitation, that they're extremely tightly correlated. So I guess my question is how you sort of teased out the signal between drought versus heat exposure.
Thank you. Why don't we take those for now, then give you an opportunity to respond, and then we'll come back to the next round, please.
I'm going to quickly address to the first question, like which is like how what are the entomological parameters that we simulate? So using the hydromass mechanistic model, we can simulate pretty much everything. We can simulate the mosquito population, the size of population, seasonality on population, and we can also simulate the malaria transmission, like the seasonality and the size too. And because we also have all the like temperature data and so on, we can also calculate bacterial capacity, R0 and so on.
Yes, so I'd be happy to answer your questions about the drought stuff. So these, the model actually looked at the risk in each individual county for daily exposures comparing drought to non-drought periods. So these models did control for daily temperature, seasonal trends, dew point temperature, as well as other declining components we know and changes of mortality over the 14-year period. So all of those factors of the temperature component were controlled for in the individual model, and these results were actually independent of those estimates. We also did a sensitivity analysis which we controlled for both PM coarse concentrations, so PM10 minus 2.5, as well as PM 2.5 estimates, and it was also results were highly robust to even including those in the model. In addition, one of the things is I know that we tend to think of drought as occurring during like a summer hot period, but a lot of these areas had drought during the winter season and the fall season and in different parts of the country. So these were not effects of drought exposures that only happen during summertime and like associated with heat wave type conditions.
And to address the third question, thank you, that was very interesting. So we wanted to put the food's nutritional aspect with respect to sustainability for a few reasons, one of which is the nutritional recommendations currently in the U.S. don't account for sustainability, and sometimes there are conflicting guidelines of what should be consumed for health versus what should be promoted for the environment. So in terms of weighting them equally, you're right that we are, and I focused on the NRF 9.3 as a very good general and well-established way to characterize nutrient density of a food. So using nutrient quality as the primary function of interest to measure a food's ability to meet a body's need for energy and nutrients. But I think it would be very interesting to look at different nutrient profiles, maybe protein or lipid profiles, or certain select vitamins to address particular needs for a vulnerable population or a disease risk, and look at the foods with respect to that. But yes, in this context, everything is weighted equally.
Jesse,
I think that handled both of them.
Okay, thanks. So,
Hopefully.
Please.
Hi, my name is Andy Jones. I'm at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. I had two real brief questions. Professor Thomas, your data were really fascinating that you were able to capture that time period. You showed us associations of mean height for Z-score across time. I'm wondering, at the margin, amongst children who were stunted by, say, 12 months, did you see the same catch-up growth? It's such a difficult thing to shift that distribution. And for Executive Director Tutwiler, the information you presented was really, really great. We know that dietary or food composition data is so poor, and the fact that you're trying to bolster it in Brazil is great. But I'm wondering, it seems like there's a lack of will to really invest in that kind of basic work of finding out what's in our food, even though it's so critical for understanding the quality of diets. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on how we can attract more investment for that kind of basic work? And I'm wondering if biodiversity is involved in any of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Lauren. I'm a student at Cornell, and I also had a question for Director Tutwiler. I was wondering how you plan to implement these changes regarding a shift to a more Mediterranean diet or a plant-based diet, and if it's being implemented more in countries that are not so culturally meat-centric, and also whether or not you've received any pushback from, for example, the U.S. and the USDA, and just kind of the big economic powers that they are.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Hu. I'm from Harvard School of Public Health. So my question is also for Dr. Jesse Berman. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the underlying biological mechanism on drought related to mortality? And also, in addition to mortality, are there any non-fatal health consequences that we should be worried about drought?
Okay. We'll take one more here and then we'll...
Sure. Yeah, my name is Giulio De Leo, Stanford University. I have a question for Tutwiler, and it's an interested question, so I would like to know how, does aquaculture fit into your vision of agricultural biodiversity, and especially integrated aquaculture, agriculture?
Thank you. Please, can respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. The question was the distribution of stunting changed by the exposure to the tsunami? And the answer is yes, there was more stunting. And was the growth post-tsunami such that the distribution of stunting was changed again? And the answer to that is yes. The entire distribution of height was shifted to the right for all children, and so the fraction of children who was stunted was declined very substantially as these children experienced the improved environments post-tsunami.
Is it on? Yeah. Thanks, and thanks for the 3 questions. Let me clarify on the first one about the Mediterranean diet. So because I was going so quickly, we aren't advocating the Mediterranean diet, but the characteristics of that diet in terms of the percentage of protein in the diet, the percentage of a grain-based food source, fruits and vegetables, etc., culturally appropriate, right, to different countries, different basic diets is what we're talking about. So just to clarify that. But also in terms of, I used to work for USDA, so I know whereof I speak in terms of the pressures that are coming. I mean, we're also not advocating for a plant-based diet. There is this important role for meat in our diets, and an important role for fish in our diets. And there's an imbalance. Some parts of the world eat too much, other parts don't get enough. And I think we forget that we are vastly under-consuming animal-based proteins in large parts of the developing world based on their nutritional needs. So in answer to the question on aquaculture, absolutely. Fish are animals, part of the diet, part of the production system. We at Bioversity are primarily focused on plant-based foods. It's our history. But we envision that this index that we're developing would certainly incorporate fish into the diet and fish into production systems. So maybe we can have a bilateral conversation about that. Investing in nutritional data. Data's boring. I know this is a group of scientists, but to a lot of donors, it's kind of boring stuff. And just investing in data for the sake of data, it's tough. It's tough to convince people to do. But I think that exploring the nutritional composition of these neglected foods is instrumental to getting them reintegrated or integrated into food systems. And I think that's one thing that we've shown in this work in Brazil, is that in order for us and Brazil to make the advances in incorporating these foods into nutrition systems, into the dietary guidelines, et cetera, they needed to see the nutritional scores. And so I did have one donor approach me and said, wow, nobody's doing this, really looking comprehensively at what are the nutritional characteristics of some of these neglected crops. So hopefully there is some interest. It's an incredibly complex thing because there's vast differences not only across species but within species. We're working on a banana that has about 1,000 times the level of vitamin A that our Chiquita banana has, but that doesn't get captured in the data. So I hope that answers questions.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Just to recap, the question was, mechanistically, how do we believe that drought biologically impacts health? And then the second question was if there are other health outcomes out there besides the ones that we looked at. So to answer your second question first, there's a number of different health outcomes that I think are really fascinating looking at between drought and health, the biggest one being the impact of drought on mental health. The studies that do exist, because drought's really no different than any other natural disaster, and we see that with hurricanes and floods and tsunamis. The mental health effects of this are enormous. And the studies that do exist from Australia have almost entirely focused on mental health outcomes, including one in PNAS that found an increase in suicide-related deaths during extreme drought events, especially among agricultural and rural populations. So that's something which, I definitely think there's a lot of room to look at here in the U.S. To answer your first question about mechanisms, that's a really big unanswered question right now. And while there isn't any good literature on it, we do have several hypotheses. Number one being the impact of drought on mental health and the stress that it causes, especially to people who rely on the environment and water sources for their livelihood. And we know that increases in stress lead to changes, cardiovascular changes in individuals. And then we think in extreme cases that can lead to, increased numbers of mortalities. For the respiratory-related disease, that outcome that we found was a little bit surprising to us, but when you consider the effect that drought has on the ecology as a whole, it can really modify things such as pollen seasons and the production of different fungal spores and other events that can trigger things like asthma attacks and COPD and exacerbate some of these respiratory-related diseases. In a study out of Europe, they showed that an extreme high heat and drought condition in Switzerland actually shrunk the hay fever season by, I think, almost 6 weeks. So it does have impacts on the ecology, and we think that could plausibly explain why we're seeing the changes in respiratory admissions that we found.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a question that I thought about last session, but I couldn't get to the mic. So we're talking about all these planetary impacts, health, human health impacts, et cetera. But one word I haven't heard often in these conversations is risk. And if you talk to the investment community, you talk to the business community, they are scared. They're scared about their supply chains. They're scared about their, some are scared about where their hotels are. You know, there are definitely ways that through the language of risk that we can speak to some of the people who aren't listening when we talk about these long-term impacts of climate change and human health. And I would just encourage this group to really talk to some financial people and engage in that kind of inquiry around how do you quantify those risks so that people who have money in the game really care about it.
Thank you. Any other questions? We still have some few minutes. We can take 2, 3 other questions.
Tom Clausen from Memory. A question for Dr. Duncan. This is an amazing data set you have, but you know, in the infectious disease area and maybe nutrition too, we don't think of a lot of opportunities to catch up in stunting. You know, once kids are kind of far along. And to the best of my knowledge, you know, the tsunami event wasn't accompanied by a massive, you know, infectious disease risk. So I'm just wondering, is there a different mechanism that's associated with the stunting that you observed, and is that more likely to have the potential for catching up over a nutritional cause or an infectious disease cause?
So that's a very good question, and the issue that the literature that I think you're referring to is largely the literature when somebody has a shock after they're born. The issue here is that what we focused on was the shock in utero, and I think the shock was twofold. The shock was maternal stress, and I established that by showing you that those children who were in utero and their mothers presented with much higher levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity were the children who were the shortest around about birth, and they were the ones who did not fully catch up. But it's also the case that in the first 18 months to 2 years after the tsunami, there was a very, very low, the price of food was very high, and access to food was very limited. So I think that these mothers also had nutritional stress, and I think both nutritional deprivation and the stress would have resulted in the births being shorter than they would have otherwise been, and those are the children that have grown. We have looked at children who were already born after the tsunami, and there is some catch-up growth, but it's nowhere near as large, which is consistent with what you would predict because there wasn't a huge amount of infectious disease, but there was still, for the kids who were very young, in the first 18 months of life, 2 years of life, there was still a nutritional shock for those children. Of course, we see nothing for the older kids, as you would expect.
Howdy, Sam Sellers, UNC Chapel Hill. So one of the growing pieces of dialogue that I've seen in the past few years in the climate change community concerns the role of gender as a moderator of vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And I wanted to ask really any of the panelists who could speak to this, how their research results varied by gender and if they can speak to gender-related issues in their research. Jesse, you mentioned the PNAS paper from Australia on suicides, for example, and there were really significant effects among men, no significant effects among women, and I imagine that's true for a lot of other health or dietary-related consequences as well.
The last question.
Yeah, so I'm getting my question in that I didn't get last time. My name is Nancy French. I'm with the Michigan Tech Research Institute, and I had to come back because I heard that data is boring, and I can't really leave that one on the table because my question earlier that I didn't get in is related to the fact that we've been looking at a lot of numbers and charts and statistics that are very important for us for making decisions and to move along this idea of the fact that people rely on the earth and the earth is important to people. Really, we need data to know these things, and unfortunately, our government is stepping down from that, if anything. They're not stepping up. So my question is not really a question, or I guess it's a question to everyone. If we're going to be relying on data and using it, and that's what I do, and I think what a lot of us do, how are we going to get that data paid for? And my original question really was specifically for monitoring, because we can go out and measure something now and get paid for it for a 3-year grant. But being able to do that sustainably over time, we have some very good mechanisms in place for collecting important what are called climate variables through the WMO and other. My question is, how can this community help to make sure that sustained data monitoring can be continued for our science?
Okay, thanks. And I will add maybe 2 questions, one to Anne and one to Duncan. And one of the biggest challenges we have with traditional food systems is the lack of investment in those food systems. And whenever you have programs that promote their nutritional values, it's traditionally the source for many poor people in these countries. So when you have programs that promote their nutritional value, they quickly get out of the reach of the very poor, and they get exported outside the countries, and then creates a new challenge for these countries. And we see this across the world. You look at the Pacific Islands, and tuna you can't even afford it if you're there, but you get all these floods that create challenges of obesity and all that. And we've not gotten into and one of the things we've not been hearing in these circles is really global trade patterns and how they drive both changes in the environment and changes in human health and the implications they have, whether you look at Africa and anything you can think about. Basic gasoline, Nigeria, I understand, exports the best crude there is, but imports the worst diesel that cannot be sold anywhere else, with huge implications for air pollution and all that. And Duncan, with your work, one of the bigger questions is the overcompensation that you see in these children. How is it likely to affect future health trajectories of these children? Are you seeing increased obesity and all that? And what is really driving that? Is it the emergency response as a result of the disaster? Because whenever you have data showing disadvantage in certain populations, you're more likely to draw in interventions to respond to those. But they are short-lived and short-term in many ways. And sometimes the changes in nutritional status of these children over time, the variability you see over time, may actually have greater health implications for them down the road. I don't know what you're seeing in your population. Anne can go first.
I feel like I have to take on the data is boring comment. So I used to be the Deputy Director General for knowledge at FAO, right? And consistently, FAO got more interest and more funding for the development projects that it was doing than for the important, critical normative work it was doing. So that's the context of my comment. I think one of the important things is to demonstrate how data can help form decisions. And that's, I think, the work we were doing in Brazil and we've done in other places, is developing a body of data and saying, this is improving your ability to help your population be, more well-fed, more healthy, et cetera. So please understand that's the context. It's just not easy to get that long-term funding for the core data that we need because people take it for granted, right? And unless you can put it in a context of how is this going to help me, this government decision maker, solve a problem, it's difficult to sustain that long-term data. So I'm fully with you, but I just want to clarify that. In terms of the plant, the diet, and the fact that these products, become out of reach of the poor, it is a challenge. But I also pushed back a bit on one of my colleagues from within the CG system who said, well, eventually we want to get to a place where fruits and vegetables are affordable for the poor, but until we get to that place, we need to biofortify food. I said, well, part of the reason we're at that place is because we haven't invested in these crops that are more nutritious. I mean, the CG, the research For example, in I think it was 2014, $240 million was spent on 3 crops. Right? $40 million was spent on the next 15 crops total. So we're neglecting to invest in those nutritious forms of food. And I don't think we can say that it's financially out of reach until we really look at how we're investing in extension and research, education.
Alex, you make an excellent point, which is that with rapid growth after birth or after the first couple of a few 18 months of life, these children who are now much taller than one would have expected may actually have deleterious consequences, present with deleterious health outcomes in adolescence or early adulthood or later on in adulthood. So first, one of the important results of our work is that we've established very clearly there is scope for catch-up growth after very large-scale negative disasters, but that may not work out so well for all these kids. And so what we're doing at the moment, we're in the field right now with support from the Wellcome Trust, collecting biomarkers which are associated with metabolic dysregulation, not just on the adults, which is of interest in of itself because one thinks that stress might result in metabolic dysregulation in several years, but also on these kids who were in utero at the time and their older siblings. And the idea is to try to understand whether exactly the mechanism that you have in mind is at play in this population. And so we're looking at the lipids, we're looking at glucose, looking at glycosylated hemoglobin, and we're also looking at inflammation, all markers of risks of diabetes, risks of heart disease, risks of strokes, which may well have be at elevated rates precisely because of this elevated rate of growth post-tsunami. And so I think it's very important for us to, even if data are boring, it's very important for us to follow these cohorts through to understand what are the long-term consequences of these major shocks, which were truly unanticipated.
Thank you. Just in the 30 seconds that I have, I just want to put one thought out there for us as a community and as a group. For me, one of the things that drew me into this field is recognizing the unique challenges a place like Africa faces with respect to planetary health. As many of you are aware, if you've seen the UN projections, we're about 1 billion people, and by 2050, you're looking at about 2.4, 2.5 billion people. And by 2100, Africa will have about 4 billion people, more people in the continent than the whole world put together between 2050 and 2100. As you look at those things, we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, the massive loss of biodiversity in the land, on the continent. We've seen huge changes in land use, rapid urbanization that is definitely changing both land use and creating new challenges for the region. We've also seen that current estimates that we've maybe used up 70% of our land for cultivation and for agriculture. And so as you look at all the intersections of these challenges and you ask yourself, how do we move forward in this place? And some of the conversations that happen at the global level on climate change and the rest are not drilling down on some of these basic challenges that we face. So when you see a woman in the village asking you why they would not cut the tree that is there, the only remaining tree in her farm for firewood, you need to have a ready answer for them. I just came back from Nigeria 2 weeks ago. Growing up, I was in a village that had 3 huge forests. These places are places at night. Before you pass those places, you have to pray. And you have to run with, almost like, I believe if we kept to it, maybe we would be beating somebody like Usain Bolt in the 100-meter dash. You have to run as fast as possible to cross those places. You pass through there now, you can't find a single tree. There are houses, there are farmlands, not a single, you couldn't even remember. You need somebody to help you identify those landmarks. That is where we are. And it's not just unique in my village. It is across the entire continent in many ways. We've lost, 70% of our tropical rainforest in the last 30 plus years. And so the challenges are huge and massive. But I think there are new opportunities, and some of the research we're hearing and being able to identify the health implications of these changes could be a huge entry point for us to begin to change mindsets around what we need to do to really sustain our civilization. May we have a good, thank you for the session, and please let us present the presenters.